What happens when a president turns his palace into a symbol of greed and his people respond with revolution? The story of Viktor Yanukovych is not just about politics. It's about betrayal, luxury, and a nation pushed to the brink. Once considered a stabilizing figure in post-Soviet Ukraine, Yanukovych's time in power came to symbolize everything that was wrong with oligarchic rule, culminating in a revolution that shocked the world. This is the story of how one man's hunger for power collided with a nation's cry for justice. Viktor Fedorovich Yanukovych was born on July 9, 1950, in the industrial city of Yanukiv, in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. He grew up in poverty, losing his mother early and being raised in a working-class environment. His rise from a troubled youth marked by 2 convictions for robbery in his early 20s to a political leader was nothing short of remarkable. Yanukovych entered politics in the 1990s, capitalizing on the chaotic post-Soviet transition. His close ties to powerful industrialists in Donbass, particularly those who would later form Ukraine's oligarchic elite, helped fuel his political ambitions. He served as the governor of Donetsk Oblast before becoming prime minister under President Leonid Kuchma in 2002. But it wasn't until 2004 that Yanukovych stepped into the national spotlight and controversy. In 2004, Yanukovych ran for president with the backing of then-President Kuchma in Russia, when initial election results declared him the winner over opposition leader Viktor Yanukovych. Widespread allegations of electoral fraud. What followed was one of the most defining moments in Ukraine's modern political history, the Orange Revolution. Massive, non-violent protests flooded Kyiv's Maidan, Nezhyhirya for weeks. Citizens demanded fair elections, transparency, and an end to the corruption embedded in Ukraine's political system. Under mounting pressure, Ukraine's Supreme Court annulled the results and ordered a rerun, which Yanukovych lost. Though defeated, he was not gone. The events of 2004 were only the beginning. Yanukovych returned as prime minister in 2006 under a coalition government. By 2010, leveraging widespread dissatisfaction with the pro-Western Yushchenko administration, he made his comeback, and this time, he won. The 2010 election brought Viktor Yanukovych to the presidency. He promised economic growth, stability, and a balanced approach between Russia and the European Union. However, his tenure soon revealed a different reality: increased authoritarianism, persecution of political opponents, and a growing dependence on Russia. Critics argued that Yanukovych wasn't governing for the Ukrainian people but for a circle of loyalists and oligarchs. At the heart of his administration was a sprawling network of corruption. Transparency International repeatedly ranked Ukraine as one of the most corrupt countries in Europe during his time in office. A golden toilet, a private zoo, chandeliers worth more than schools. Could a palace become the final straw that sparked a revolution? By 2013, Yanukovych's opulent lifestyle was no longer a secret. His lavish private residence, Mezhyhirya, located outside Kyiv, became the stuff of legend. Though technically state property, the compound was privatized under suspicious circumstances and renovated into a symbol of unchecked power. Mezhyhirya featured gold-plated bathroom fixtures, exotic animals, a private golf course, a fleet of luxury cars, and custom-built men. It stood in stark contrast to the economic struggles faced by ordinary Ukrainians. Journalists and opposition figures increasingly highlighted Mezhyhirya as a visual metaphor for state plunder. But it was a single decision in late 2013 that turned public discontent into mass protests. For years, Ukraine had been negotiating an association agreement with the European Union, signaling a potential shift westward. The deal was widely supported by the public, especially younger Ukrainians and urban professionals eager for integration with Europe. But in November 2013, just days before the agreement was to be signed, Yanukovych abruptly suspended preparations. Instead, he announced closer ties with Russia, reportedly after heavy pressure from Vladimir Putin. The betrayal was immediate and visceral. Within hours, protesters began gathering in Maidan Square. Initially, the protests were peaceful, focused on European integration and governmental accountability. But they quickly grew in size and intensity, transforming into a full-blown uprising against Yanukovych's regime. By late November and early December 2013, the demonstrations now known as the Euromaidan movement drew tens of thousands. Protesters set up tents, built barricades, and occupied government buildings. In an attempt to crush dissent, Yanukovych deployed riot police. Brutal beatings, abductions, and later, the use of live ammunition against demonstrators shocked the world. The turning point came in February 2014, when over 100 protesters, many of them unarmed, were killed by security forces in Kyiv. International condemnation was swift. The EU and US imposed sanctions on members of Yanukovych's government. Inside Ukraine, ministers resigned, party members defected, and his grip on power began to crumble. On February 22, 2014, Yanukovych fled the capital. His departure marked the collapse of his government and the start of a new, tumultuous chapter in Ukraine's history. Viktor Yanukovych rose from poverty to become president, but his legacy was shaped by corruption, repression, and ultimately, flight. In segment 2, Looted Legacy, Mezhyhirya, we'll explore what investigators uncovered after his fall, secret ledgers, embezzled billions, and the trial that followed in his absence. What if the keys to your country's stolen wealth were found lying beneath gold ceilings and crystal chandeliers? When Viktor Yanukovych fled Ukraine in 2014, he left behind more than an empty palace. From gilded rooms to secret ledgers, what investigators discovered inside Mezhyhirya stunned not just Ukraine, but the entire world. This is the inside story of the stolen billions, the forensic hunt to track them, and how a fugitive president became the center of Europe's largest corruption case. When protesters finally broke past the gates of Mezhyhirya, on February 22, 2014, they didn't find a government facility or a presidential office. They found a mansion unlike anything Ukraine had ever seen, stretching over 350 acres. Mezhyhirya wasn't just a residence, it was a private empire. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, mahogany staircases, gold-plated bathroom fixtures, an opulent yacht dock, a zoo with exotic animals, a replica Galleon restaurant, a private golf course, and even a helicopter pad. It was a billionaire's fantasy built on taxpayer money. It was as if Versailles had been remade by a Bond villain, remarked one reporter. The total cost of Mezhyhirya was estimated to exceed $1 billion US, though its actual value was impossible to pin down due to complex ownership structures. But beyond the visual spectacle, activists and journalists found something more explosive. Documents, thousands of them, many partially destroyed, some floating in nearby ponds. These weren't love letters or family photos. They were records of offshore bank accounts, secret ledgers, wire transfers, procurement contracts, and financial records, detailing a massive system of state looting. A team of volunteers, journalists, and forensic accountants calling themselves the Yanukovych group quickly began recovering and drying out the waterlogged documents. Over 200 folders of financial data were eventually salvaged. They discovered that Yanukovych had effectively turned the Ukrainian state into a cash machine for himself and his closest allies. Government ministries routinely overpaid for projects. Contracts were funneled to shell companies, and huge sums were routed to offshore havens like Cyprus, the British Virgin Islands, and one entry showed a $12 million cash payment to Paul Manafort, the American political consultant who would later become Donald Trump's campaign chairman. In 1 year alone, it was estimated that over $3 billion USD vanished from Ukraine's budget through embezzlement. They thought he'd taken everything when he fled, but the paper trail told a deeper story of systemic theft disguised as government. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, created after Yanukovych's fall, began coordinating with international watchdogs and financial institutions to follow the money. The findings were staggering. Hundreds of shell companies were traced to Yanukovych's associates. Luxury properties in London, Vienna, and Moscow were allegedly linked to stolen funds. Dozens of artworks and antique vehicles were found, some of which had been smuggled into Russia. Interpol was notified, and Yanukovych was placed on an international wanted list. But the path to justice would not be simple. In 2017, Ukraine began formal proceedings against Viktor Yanukovych for high treason and complicity in war relating not only to the corruption scandal, but to his role in inviting Russian military action during Ukraine's internal unrest. Since Yanukovych remained in exile in Russia where he was granted protection, he was tried in absentia in Bolin District Court. The trial featured over 50 witnesses, including former ministers, security officials, and opposition leaders. The prosecution argued that Yanukovych's refusal to sign the EU deal, crackdown on an eventual letter to Putin requesting military support were all part of a broader betrayal of Ukraine's sovereignty. In January 2019, Yanukovych was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to 13 years in prison, but with no extradition treaty between Ukraine and Russia, the ruling remained largely symbolic. Even after the trial, investigators continued tracing assets. The Ukrainian government partnered with Western governments, including the United States, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, to freeze and reclaim stolen funds. In Switzerland, over 70 million Swiss francs in assets linked to Yanukovych's circle were frozen. In the US, Department of Justice initiatives sought to locate illicit properties and laundered funds. But repatriating the money was complicated. Complex corporate veils, jurisdictional challenges, and Russian obstructionism made most attempts frustratingly slow. Meanwhile, Yanukovych maintained his innocence from Russia. In occasional interviews, he portrayed himself as a victim of a coup, insisted the documents found at Mezhyhirya. Yet for most Ukrainians, he had already become the symbol of stolen dreams. In the years following the revolution, Mezhyhirya was turned into a public space. Citizens toured the estate, viewing the luxury once hidden behind high walls. For many, it became an educational tool, a physical reminder of how power, when unchecked, can devour a nation. Teachers brought schoolchildren to see the gold toilets and tiger cages. Protesters planted trees in remembrance of the fallen. Artists painted murals on the estate walls. Mezhyhirya transformed from a palace of power to a monument of accountability. The fall of Yanukovych exposed more than corruption. It uncovered how deeply a leader can embed himself into a system designed to protect him. His case became a lesson in forensic justice, global finance, and political betrayal. In segment 3, Judged by History, Yanukovych, Exile, and the Legacy of a Stolen Presidency, we'll explore how his name continues to shape Ukraine's path, especially in the shadow of Russian aggression and ongoing reform. What happens when a leader escapes justice but not history? Viktor Yanukovych fled Ukraine in 2014, believing he could escape accountability, but in the years that followed, his name became inseparable from the word betrayal. While he remains protected in Russia, the story of his presidency continues to shape Ukraine's destiny, its war with Russia, and its struggle to redefine democracy in the post-Soviet space. This is the legacy of the man who tried to rule behind Golden Gate Sand, the country that tore them down. After fleeing Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych surfaced in Rostov-on-Don, a Russian city near the Ukrainian border. The Russian government, under President Vladimir Putin, granted him asylum, though officially denying any special treatment. Behind the scenes, reports suggested Yanukovych lived in a secure, state-monitored compound with a security detail and controlled press access. While in exile, Yanukovych gave carefully staged interviews. He insisted he was still the rightful president of Ukraine, decried the Maidan revolution as a Western-backed coup, and blamed the violence on the protesters, not his own forces. Internationally, his credibility was non-existent. In Ukraine, he became a pariah. He was stripped of his presidential title, assets were frozen, and his name was erased from official histories. But his exile wasn't the end of his influence, it was just the beginning of a darker legacy. In the power vacuum that followed Yanukovych's fall, Ukraine veered westward. A new government signed the EU association agreement and began reforms. But this shift triggered swift retaliation from Moscow. Just weeks after Yanukovych fled, Russia annexed Crimea in March 2014. The move was justified, in part, by a letter Yanukovych had written to Vladimir Putin, requesting Russian intervention in Ukraine to restore order. This letter became a key piece of evidence in his treason trial. Simultaneously, Russian-backed separatists launched an insurgency in Donbass, leading to a war that continues to this day. In many ways, Yanukovych's presidency didn't just end in disgrace, it helped ignite a war. His legacy became a cautionary tale of what happens when democratic institutions are hollowed out from within. And for Ukraine, his ghost loomed over every attempt to move forward. His palace is now a museum, his trial held without him, but his fingerprints are still on Ukraine's wounds. Even as Ukraine underwent successive leadership, Volodymyr Zelensky, the opacity, the Russian dependence. During the 2022 full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russian state media again attempted to float Yanukovych as a potential transitional leader. If Kaju were to fall, the Ukrainian people met this with scorn. His return was politically Russia still viewed him as useful, underscored how deeply he was embedded in the Kremlin's strategy. Meanwhile, activists continued to track assets, push for international action, and document the damage caused under his rule. In Ukrainian classrooms, Yanukovych is not taught as a legitimate leader, but as a warning. School children now visit Mezhyhirya, not as guests, but as citizens walking through the ruins of unchecked power. Journalists produced documentaries, museums created exhibits. Protest sites like Maidan became memorials to the over 100 civilians killed during the 2014 Revolution of Fan, referred to as the Heavenly Hundred. Yanukovych's face is not on statues but on cautionary posters. In literature and satire, he's portrayed as a buffoonish villain, a puppet of Moscow, a man more concerned with chandeliers than constitutions. His infamous golden toilet became a national punchline, a political metaphor, yet behind the jokes lies real pain. Families still mourn the protesters' loss, veterans still fight in the east, economists still calculate the billions stolen. In a strange twist, Yanukovych's corruption helped unify Ukraine's fractured identity. The desire to never repeat his presidency became a driving force behind anti-corruption laws, judicial reforms, and civil society movement. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the High Anti-Corruption Court, and transparency initiatives like procurement systems were all born in the shadow of his crimes. His presidency hurt the country, but his fall galvanized it. Surveys in 2023 showed record-high trust in democratic institutions, thanks in part to civic education and grassroots organizing. Ukraine's move toward the EU and NATO gained public support not just out of geopolitical necessity, but out of moral conviction. Yanukovych may have fled, but Ukraine stayed to rebuild. What can the world learn from the story of Viktor Yanukovych? That corruption is never victimless, it erodes trust, invites external influence, and can destabilize entire regions. That public memory matters by keeping the story alive. Citizens ensure that abuse isn't repeated, and that justice, even when delayed or symbolic, as Yanukovych may never serve prison time. But he stands condemned by courts, by history, and by the people he betrayed. Other nations have since studied Ukraine's post-Yanukovych anti-corruption model. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, Mezhyhirya has become a case study not in grandeur, but in governance gone wrong. In the global fight against kleptocracy, Yanukovych's name is now shorthand for what must be prevented. Viktor Yanukovych thought exile would protect him, but history had other plans. His palace turned into a museum, his allies tried in courts, and his legacy used as fuel to reform a nation. Subscribe to State Affairs Review for more in-depth cinematic investigations into the rise and fall of power around the globe. What other stories of political betrayal do you think the world needs to see next? Share this video if you believe corruption should never be forgotten, always judged by history.